This is the screencast for the differences and similarities in between President Warren Harding and President Calvin Coolidge. Our 29th president, President Harding, is the man on the left, and our 30th president, Calvin Coolidge, is the man on the right. One similarity that I would have down between these two is that both of these men are Republicans. Both these men are part of the Republican Party during the time of the 1920s. And although this picture might seem a little confusing because you see it says for President Warren Harding and for Vice President Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge would be the vice president to Warren Harding during 1921 to 1923, but Warren Harding would be ending his term early because he would die to a heart attack, leaving Calvin Coolidge to deal with some of the issues that were brought up during Harding's presidency. Now, Harding's presidency would be kind of described as uh, kind of riddled with scandals. It's kind of like tarnished. It's not that everything he did was bad. It's just that a lot of his cabinet members would be uh, pulling him into a lot of public issues in terms of scandals, like kind of like what you see today when it comes to Trump scandals or Hillary scandals or even Nixon scandals, whatever that sort of thing. Um, but not everything he did was bad. And I'm not gonna focus on a lot of what happened was bad. I'm only gonna really give one example. But what he did beneficial to the United States is that he ran on a platform known as normalcy. And normalcy is an isolationism way of saying that we're basically taking the power that we got from World War One, because the United States would be one of the major economic and political powers of the world. The United States being a superpower in that sense, coming out of World War One. He's basically taking that and reducing it. So he's not furthering economic influence in the globe. He's basically taking back and returning from heroics to normalcy. And that's a lot of what the United States citizens wanted. So one of the ways that he's going to be doing this is known as the Washington Naval Armament Conference of 1921. So this is the conference between four major powers: Japan, France, Great Britain, and the United States. This is basically saying, since Japan had taken over a lot of German colonies during World War One, there'd be this tension between Great Britain, France, and Japan, saying who has the dominant force in Asia. The United States will also be interfering with this since they have the power, since they have the Philippines, that is their territory. So this is the sense of we're basically taking our naval power and diffusing the tensions between them. We're basically reducing the amount of naval bases, the amount of ships, the amount of naval soldiers, that sort of thing. And since that tension is diffused, that will cause a less likely chance for any of these countries to go to war with one another for lands in the Pacific region. So that's lands in the Pacific Ocean, over in Asia. Now, one thing that Harding actually did really well with this is that it did diffuse the tensions um, between Japan and the United States for the time being. Although some of you might know that later on that might not be the case, especially during in the late 1930s and 1940s when we would be going to war with Japan. um, Now, this is the scandal that I'm going to be touching on for Harding's presidency. This scandal is known as the Teapot Dome scandal, in which case one of the members of the Ohio Gang being the nickname that the media gave to Warren Harding's cabinet, the cabinet being a number of men that were appointed by Harding at the time to try and help him in certain aspects of United States affairs. And one of these men is known as Albert Fall. Albert Fall would uh, be having political rights over some of the oil reserves in Wyoming that were specifically designated to be for the Navy in case of wartime. So in case the United States would be going to war, the Navy wouldn't have to worry about how much oil they had in terms of running their ships um, for the war effort, as they had this oil reserves in Wyoming. And Albert Fall basically sold those reserves to different oil companies, and the oil companies would be basically paying him off. So oil companies would be giving him money so that they could dig in these reserves and further their own industry, while also bribing one of the cabinet members of the United States. So, unfortunately, Harding would die before he could deal with the Teapot Dome scandal. It's not something that like he was directly related to, but he would die to basically to that heart attack, and he wouldn't be able to deal with the effects of it, kind of leaving it to Calvin Coolidge. This is the man that you're looking at now. He'd be taking over the presidency in 1923 because Harding would die, and he would also be dealing with, the President Harding's scandals, like the Teapot Dome scandal. He would be restoring faith in the government. People are kind of like a little wary, like, okay, the government's being rather corrupt. We need to what's going on with our government? We didn't vote for this. But Coolidge would be kind of restoring faith in the government. He works with the investigators. He's establishing that, like, yes, there was a scandal. We're going to be basically working our best to try and make sure it doesn't happen again. That sort of thing. He gives this. He's not like Harding. He's not He's not as outspoken as Harding was. He giving him the name of Silent Cal. So, but that's not completely true, as he did hold a large amount of press conferences. It was over 500 during his presidency, and he would also be having radio talk times, in which case he'd be basically speaking directly to the American public over the radio, which is still kind of new at the time. So like people saw that as like a revolutionary way of like actually talking to the public. But there would be this time in Coolidge's presidency is known as the Coolidge Prosperity, and this is when the 1920s would kick off economically. And unemployment would be lowered, inflation would decrease. So basically, more people have jobs, and the price for goods and services would be low. So more people can basically buy bread, not because just they have a job, but just because the price of bread is lower. So people don't have to worry too much about that. So he kind of is also in the same sense as Harding, because they are both Republican. They both have like the same economic ideology, this sort of laissez-faire ideology, in which case the government is basically giving free hands, like hands off. We're not touching the economy or the industry. We're letting it go, be its own thing. Basically giving less regulations on industries. And that kind of helps kick off this whole Roaring Twenties. That's the 1920s. That's the nickname for the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, because everyone, or mostly everyone, is having economic booms, or in which case they'd be able to enjoy more economic benefits. One of the things, though, that Coolidge does end up doing is known as the Kellogg-Briand Pact, in which case he basically signed a pact with a number of countries trying to reduce military efforts. So basically, they're kind of like outlawing war here, saying that war is bad, kind of like a pacifist in a sense, but not like complete, like we're not going to go to war at all. It's just like kind of that reduction, normalcy type of thing. But it didn't really work out too well, because there wasn't any sort of punishment for the countries that did go to war, or like did have any sort of like militaristic powers outside of their own borders. But one of the things that Coolidge did, not with only the So one of the things that Coolidge did, not with only with the the military, but as well as the economy, is that he would actually be sending troops in 1926 to Nicaragua, as Nicaragua was going under a revolution at the time, and he'd basically be protecting United States businesses that were in Nicaragua, basically making sure that American business would not be hurt in any sort of way. And that's the only time really government is being involved when it comes to business, is in making sure that foreign powers aren't interfering with it. And it's not just in Nicaragua, but it also be happening in Mexico in the later year of 1927. However, we did not send troops in that case, as Coolidge managed to handle that issue more diplomatically rather than militarily. So there is this sense in both of them kind of like reducing America's political and military power in both of their presidencies. But both of them are also rather different in a sense. Harding's more outspoken. He's very, I'd say he's an extrovert, while Calvin Coolidge is an introvert. He's not as outspoken as Harding, but he isn't just a shut-in that doesn't talk to the public. And where Harding had his political scandals, Coolidge would be the one guy that kind of restores the integrity of the United States for the American people. He would be the guy that's kind of like upright and upstanding, kind of giving the United States a sort of respect, in which case the United States would retain its, I want to say, its image in that sense. But both of these men would be a part of the Republican Party. Both of these men would be leading the United States during one of the most economic prosperous times in the United States. It's just that Harding would be dealing a lot more, I would say, negative impacts in the United States than Coolidge did. Although Coolidge also did have some little blips every now and then, mainly with that whole Nicaragua, sending troops there. But overall, Coolidge is the man that kind of led the United States during the most economic, one of the most economic prosperities in the United States history. So I would say those are good similarities and differences between Calvin Coolidge and Warren Harding.